I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. Here we are, three master instructors of the Oxygen Advantage, and we had a meeting in Galway here about, what was it, about 4 weeks ago. And Leo Daniel Ryan, who I know many years, was giving a presentation from his background as a strength and conditioning coach and the application of breathing in sports. And I think this is a conversation that really needs to be had, because strength and conditioning is, of course, about strength and conditioning. But what about the player who's gassing out too soon? And what about the application of functional breathing for functional movement? And is there a role of breathing in strength and conditioning? And could the strength and conditioning coach that incorporates breathing have an advantage over the one that doesn't? So anyway, that's what this conversation is being about. So I have Daniel Paulson, my usual co-host, coming from Sweden, and Leo Daniel Ryan is based in the east coast of Ireland. So welcome, everybody, and let the conversation begin.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick, and thanks for having me on. Where to start? Yeah, I suppose just to give the folks there a bit of a background about me. I trained with you way back in 2004, and my history is a bit interesting as a trainer, because I had chronic childhood asthma, which after you taught me originally the Buteyko and then migrated later on into the Oxygen Advantage. But when you taught me back in 2004, I was at one stage sick for 6 months in bed with asthma. So out of a total of just over a year, I spent 6 months in bed. I was on 3 inhalers, 14 courses of antibiotics, and over 425 steroid tablets, prednisolone, 5 milligram steroid tablets. I know, because I kept my tax forms. But to go from there, where 18 months later I was symptom and medication free, and then returning to sport, and then I went on to be a trainer and S&C coach. That is the 30-second elevator pitch of where I'm coming from. So what I'm trying to say is look, if I can do this, and if I've found that breathing has been a massive help to me, then it is without doubt going to help every other person that's there, because I would consider myself one of the weakest people in the room. Breathing wise speaking, like, my anatomy is awful for sport. I've got a really long, thin nose with small nostrils and a thin jaw. I've had 11 teeth extractions when I was a kid because I had too many teeth. And then, of course, I had the asthma on top of that as well. So from a physical performance point of view, I found that breathing was just incredible. In fact, I still remember the first day that I went back after all of my training. I went back onto the pitches. I played Gaelic football, which is an Irish sport, Daniel, and that some viewers might know. And I went back playing, and I remember we were doing 80-meter repeat sprints in mud that was like that thick. And it was one of those sessions where the team were just flogged, and I felt like I was walking over the mud, like I was running on water. It was just rep after rep, sprint after sprint. I would finish each one, and my breath restored almost automatically. By the time I was back to the start line, I was ready to go again, and I destroyed everybody in that session. And I was like, whoa, this stuff is powerful, really powerful. But kept it to myself for a long time. And then eventually, when I really got the sports science behind me and my understanding, then I decided to go challenge it and go, well, what's going on? Because nobody was talking about this stuff. Nobody at all. This is back even 2015, 2016. There was no conversations about breathing in sport, and certainly its effects on
Leo, there's still hardly any. Sorry to cut across you there. There is still hardly any conversations about breathing in sports. Like, if you think of any of the university curriculum at the moment, aside from maybe George Dallam and a couple of others, is really being overlooked. But I'd say this will change.
Mm-hmm. Oh, will, because it's been driven by top level sports. Like, we had, obviously, Daniel, you're in CrossFit. We had Nigel Beach over with us, who's involved in, I mean, you tell the guys there, Patrick, just a couple of your instructors who are involved in maybe top level sports in general. Do you mind saying?
Yeah, but pretty much across so many different spectrums, from MMA to rugby. And I think, yeah, we had about 25 people coming in from all corners of the earth, from South America to New Zealand. And each one of those were professionals in their own field. and working with some of the top teams on earth. In actual fact, 3 of the people in the room, between them, were working with the All Blacks, with the Roses, and also in terms of the same instruction being used with the Irish rugby team. So I think it's definitely getting out there at this level, but it still has to trickle down. That's the thing. And how many strength and conditioning coaches know about breathing? How many of them really understand it?
I think that it's coming more for people looking for the extra edge versus breathing and sleep as a foundation. So it's moving in from, okay, I'm looking for something that somebody else is not doing and bring it in, versus something that's a staple. Like this is what you need to do, because if your breathing and sleep is not intact, you will never perform at your full potential. You could be the best on the team, the best in the world, but you could have been better. So I think that is slowly moving in to every sport, but it takes time. Definitely takes time.
But I suppose, Daniel,
these guys are keeping it quiet to themselves. They're not letting people know, because that's what they do. But that's our job, right? We're trying to push it out there.
That's it. But Leo, I'd say what people are intrigued are, what do you think the actual contribution to your performance improvement was? Because most people don't consider that how you breathe during physical exercise is influenced by how you breathe off the field. And they don't also consider that physical training is not going to change your breathing patterns unless you're swimming. Or unless you're actively incorporating specific breathing protocols into your physical training. So what do you think? Because people must be wondering what on earth is after happening that you were able to make those strides.
Yeah, these were the types of questions that I had back. I went back and trained with you for the Oxygen Advantage as an instructor back in 2015. It was the Buteyko, and 2016 was your first OA course that you had out, if I remember right. And I had these same questions because at the same time I discovered other breathing methods and was looking at the convergence of all of them and trying to understand it. So in 2017, I put it to the test. And I said, you know what, I'm going to run a marathon. I hadn't ran in 10 years. I hadn't ran in 7 years. And it was something that I always wanted to do as a kid. I'd stopped playing my elite level sport and I was more focused on coaching at this stage. And I wanted to answer those questions. I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to run a marathon. I'm going to do 0 endurance training. Hadn't endurance trained at all in the 7 years. No running, biking, swimming, nothing. And I said, I'm going to get some testing done. I'm going to do a VO2 Max test and find out what's going on. And that started to dive me down the rabbit hole because, again, there was no research papers at the time. There was no evidence of what was going on inside. So I used myself as a case study. And what I found was fascinating. When I ran the first VO2 Max test, and for those that don't know, we actually drew up a little whiteboard earlier on just before we came on board.
Like I said, that's what we wanted to talk about, because you drew a good picture at our meeting that we wanted to talk about the aerobic state, the anaerobic threshold, the anaerobic state, and VO2 max, and using intensity and time on the Y and the X axis.
Brilliant. So this forms the most fundamental assessment of how well you use oxygen in sport. So the way the test works is, I did it running because I was running a marathon. You could do a biking or rowing depending on your event. So you put a mask on you and you're strapped up to a heart rate monitor. And the mask is hooked up to a machine and it analyzes your oxygen consumption and your carbon dioxide expiration. And that's what it does. And then you have the heart rate monitor tracking your heart rate as you go along. The test then, what you'll see in this overall test is, if you follow that blue line, this is the start of the test, and you start walking and it's fine, it's no problem. And then after a couple of minutes, the person conducting the test will either up the speed or will up the gradient on the test. And that continues to increase and increase and increase throughout the test until eventually you reach your peak, which is your VO2 max. When that happens, the test stops and then you recover afterwards. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this line here, this blue line here, was how the machine would track your oxygen consumption throughout the test. So how well you use oxygen throughout the test. So, for example, the elite athletes in the world, you're talking cross-country skiers who are highly endurance-based athletes, they'd have a VO2 max of about 90 liters per kilogram of body weight. Okay, so they're up at 90. You then would have a lot of endurance athletes around, the marathon, cross-country skiers, rowers would have extremely high VO2 maxes between 70 to 90. And then as a sport kind of becomes more power-based, then people's VO2 max test comes down and down and down. To give you an idea, anything above 45 on a VO2 max test is considered elite for the population. Okay, so in other words, they have a really good oxygen carrying capacity. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And anything below that, then you're looking at intermediate standard to weak standards of oxygen usage. Now, for me, in fact, before I go in for me, let me just see. Okay, yeah. So for me, when I ran this test, again, I hadn't ran in 7 years. I ran the test and I finished it. And the tester, his name is Sean, says to me, "Well, how do you think you got on?" And I says, "I don't have a clue how I got on. That's why you're here. You tell me." And he goes, "It's pretty impressive, Leo." He says, "Your VO2 was 52.1. He says, "Now, obviously I have triathletes and marathon runners, they'd be a lot higher, but you haven't ran in 7 years." He says, "That's pretty incredible that you're able to produce that." He says, "Did you not do any endurance training?" I says, "None." He says, "Okay." He says, "But the most interesting thing for me was how well you used oxygen, which is called your oxygen uptake, fraction of oxygen uptake." So at rest, we typically use about 3 to 3.5% oxygen. So the oxygen in the air, we can draw, there's 21% in the air, we can draw it and use 3 to 3.5%. In sport, typically, and in exercise, typically you can use up to about maybe 6.5. After that, you're considered very elite, and only the top of the top would draw more. And I was withdrawing over 7% oxygen. Okay, so at the top of my oxygen usage, which is called your anaerobic threshold, which is up here, I was using 7% oxygen. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what happens after that is in this test, because it's a graded test, as it continues to get tougher and tougher and tougher, I start to then reuse lactate as a fuel source, and you go anaerobic. Okay, so in other words, it's time to failure. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So anything to my left of this orange line, I'm using oxygen as my main fuel source, and anything to the right of this line, I'm predominantly using lactate as a fuel source. And that's really, really important, because the research in general would show that it's difficult to improve a VO2 max, but it's very trainable to improve how you use your oxygen. Okay, in other words, the AT, the anaerobic threshold, is much more trainable than the overall VO2 max. So think of your VO2 max as generally it's your genetics and how you were brought up and where you live determine your VO2 max. Whereas this is a really effective this is a really trainable aspect of the test. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Now, we can talk later on. I mean, in research, it would show that you can improve this by about 5 to 15%, which isn't very much. But in reality, I've talked to a lot of coaches, and this is very trainable to improve this. And you just don't improve it with traditional means. which is interesting, right? We all know where we're going there. So this is what the test is showing, and this is how my test was at 7%. What was even more fascinating was I did put my own little spin on the test. And I asked Sean, the tester, to go, I want you to mark on the test every time I put my thumbs up. Okay? So what was interesting was that when I put my thumbs up was exactly at this point here. Okay? So within 15 seconds of me hitting this threshold, I put my thumb up. What did that thumb signal mean? It meant I went using from all nasal breathing to using my nose to inhale and my mouth to exhale. Now that had never been done before. And that data was unique to me, but it was never in a research paper, that your anaerobic threshold could be related to how you breathe in a trained athlete. Does that make sense? So I thought this was amazing. Because now I had a means of how I was going to finish this marathon. Because obviously I couldn't use heart rate zones. I couldn't pace myself because I hadn't been running at all. But I knew that if I could breathe just with my nose, in and out of my nose, that at least I would have the energy to last the whole marathon. So what I did for the marathon then was I taped my mouth. I taped my mouth and I ran the marathon, the whole marathon with mouth taped, and got to the end and was fresh as a daisy, not a bother.
It's so cool. I'm sure plenty of your competitors must have been looking and wondering what the hell's going on here, whatever landed myself into.
Exactly. Yeah, you're right. It was the only person that got a stranger look was a gentleman doing it for charity where he was running with a wheelchair backwards. But it was funny because he'd be passing by people and they'd be giving you, oh, hi, how are you? How are you getting on? Keep going. And then they'd see me with my mouth taped and they'd do a double and a triple take and be going, what are you doing? And I'm like, I can't talk. Keep going.
It's interesting that you said that you reached your AT and you switched over to nose-mouth breathing. And we spoke to one of the other instructors that actually he went all the way up to VO2 Max, essentially nose breathing, which I think is remarkable if you can do that, because once you get up to those levels, I don't know how many liters per minute that you breathe in and out, but it's significant.
Well, I think Daniel, sorry to cut across you. I think Leo, when he was talking about his anatomy, is going to be a limiting factor here, unless he was to use something like nasal dilators. And normally, when it's looked at in the literature, you switch from nose to mouth breathing when you're breathing between 35 and 41 liters of air per minute. Yeah. But that's going to be influenced by your genetics. Yeah. So if you have somebody like Leo that, say, for example, because of his asthma and mouth breathing as a child, it can alter the craniofacial, development with narrower nostrils, then he's even got more resistance to his breathing, which in turn is going to hold him back. Yeah, it's funny, but what's really the question that's really bugging me here is, why did you go anaerobic at that point? Was it because, okay, I can understand that you had to switch to mouth breathing because the air hunger was too much. Mm-hmm. And air hunger is driven, at least by carbon dioxide increase or accumulation. Mm-hmm. So when you were breathing in and out through your nose, you had fairly high carbon dioxide in the blood, probably about 44, 45 millimeters of mercury. And this would have caused an increased oxygen delivery from the hemoglobin to the working muscles to keep you aerobic. Mm-hmm. But at some point, the air hunger just got too much and you had to get rid of carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. And you did that by breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth. And it was the loss of carbon dioxide that caused a reduced oxygen delivery from the hemoglobin to the working muscles. And that's why you went anaerobic.
Well, with that, yes. Well, the question is, what is it driven by? It's driven by metabolic acidosis. In other words, there's so much carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion and heat being produced by the cells, because it's a graded test. Remember, the test keeps getting tougher. It doesn't get any easier. So because the work rate of the muscle, that my system then couldn't clear all of that. Now it becomes excessive, right? Acidosis in my blood, and I couldn't clear it quick enough, which then led my mind. It became too much for me, mentally and physically taxing, and then I had to change vent in order to sustain my rate. So I changed vent, which then also encouraged me to go anaerobic to enable me to keep on going at the same intensity. This is where breathing for health and breathing for performance are at the other end of the continuum. For health, carbon dioxide is really, really important to get oxygen into that cell. Yeah. In fact, a lot of people are too sensitive to the carbon dioxide, and so they breathe off too early. But when you're talking about pushing yourself to your limits, you're producing a lot more carbon dioxide and heat and hydrogen ion than you're able to get rid of at a quick enough rate. And that's why you can't then access that oxygen, and so your body reuses the lactate as a fuel source. So
could it be something else, Leo? Is that with the increased carbon dioxide in the blood, you've got increased oxygen delivery to the working muscles, which in turn is oxidizing hydrogen ion to form water. So you're reducing acidity that way as well because of the oxygen effect.
Possibly, and these are all, you're absolutely right, Patrick, and these are all aspects that need to be researched and understood, that we're here to kind of say to researchers and say to people who are out here and interested in this field, look, we now know this part of the equation. Now let's continue to build on the research underneath, and instead of using applied physiology, let's find out what's actually going on. What I did with this is, as I said, I'm a case study, and that doesn't stand for much in science. But I then got I actually paid for 12 people, and I've been training them for 2 years at that stage in breathing, as well as conditioning for Gaelic Games. And I paid for them to do the VO2 Max test as well as I had done it. And what was really interesting is that they all hit this point, this anaerobic threshold, at a similar time for me. Now, it's a small sample size, it's 13 people altogether, but it's a start. And it certainly then would build on some other research, which is suggesting that in trained people, that when you switch from all nose to nose mouth, that certainly you turn anaerobic quicker. Let's put it that way. But there are people then, if they have very strong jaw lines, very good anatomy, there is evidence to also suggest that athletes can, and it's very possible for humans to breathe through their nose through a full VO2 max test and go to 100%. Does that make sense too? So the way I use this, and I would call it like a breathing level system. I know other people call it the breathing gears. So Brian McKenzie, who you had on the podcast before, Brian and I were actually talking at this time back in 2017 when I was testing this. He was testing something similar with his athletes, and he was using a VO2 max test as well. And then Rob Wilson and Brian ended up coming out with their version of the breathing gears, which is a little bit more in depth than this. I've kind of kept it real simple, because I just don't think that the research is behind it enough to give any other insights into what's going on. But in anybody that I've trained since, I would say there is a strong correlation between all nasal breathing and switching over to nose-mouth breathing and using lactate as a fuel source.
Yeah. But you talked about the VO2 max here. What if you reach that level and you go you go very high up, you get into the anaerobic state? If you want to come back over and over again several times, how would you train that, and how would you use that? So you're to the right on this curve and you want to get back, and then you go up again, and tennis, in football, ice hockey, those sports.
Beautiful. So I look at this as a part of the strength continuum. Okay. So what I mean by strength continuum, on one hand for the body, when applied to sport, you got relaxation on one side of the continuum. Yeah. And then on the other side, you have maximal strength. So you're talking about using breathing, and you could power in that as well, right? So maximal strength and power. So you're talking about if you're using breathing for, let's say, CrossFit, where you're doing multiple reps of an exercise, or let's say soccer, where you're doing a sprint and then recovering, or judo, in my case, where you would use it to be throwing people and use your power in activity, and then you recover, yeah? Mm. So if you use at this end, your breathing has a role to play in relaxation and in the generation of maximal strength and power. So on the one hand, if you have no strength or power and it's very light exercise, take for example, like going for a walk or a jog, well, then you'll go forever and ever and ever and ever and ever because it's just about energy, right? But when you start using breathing for power, for force production, well, then you start using up energy a lot faster. So all you're doing is you're using your energy not only for activity, for physiology, using oxygen, but then you're also using it for the generation of extra power. So if you train your breathing as a baseline, it will help you to access here and recover quicker between relaxation and max strength. Does that make sense? Because you'll use your breathing for generating force, for generating IAP, for generating more muscle power, but then you'll recover and recover. You'll use your energy for endurance, for keep on going and going and going deeper into your set, and then you recover more. So a lot of people don't look at training their breathing specifically, but what I'm saying is that it absolutely can be used for that purpose. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, and also, like, I know it's more specific, but you have, while you do something as far as, let's say, running in soccer or sprint, what you should think about. I know we discussed this before, but also afterwards, if the game is on the other side and you have 20 seconds to recover, do you use certain training protocols such as nose breathing with long exhales, breathe light in the actual games? I know in judo it must be very difficult, but you have maybe pauses. But once you have these 20 to 30 to 40-second breaks on and off,
beautiful,
that are sport specific.
Okay, so now we're talking about applying this baseline data across a real life sport, yeah?
Yeah.
I suppose before we dive into that, what I want to maybe map out here, when I talk about maximal strength or power, we're really talking about force production. We're talking about muscle contraction. Does that make sense? That is typically done in an anaerobic state. Okay. Where you're think of Usain. I always like to go back to this. So Usain Bolt is a 100-meter sprinter, fastest man in the world, sub 10 seconds, right? He uses mainly creatine phosphate as an energy system. This is way up here at the top end of your VO2 max for an endurance runner. Okay. You then have there's an Irish 400-meter runner called David Gillick, right? So 400 meters is very much a sport that works on the edge of this anaerobic threshold. In other words, you produce a lot of power, but it's not at the same force as Usain Bolt. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in other words, he can't run the same speed, but he has a little bit more endurance in him. Yep. Then you have high-end endurance like Mo Farah, which is all endurance, and they don't use any force at all, or any very little anaerobic metabolism at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
They're all at the other end. Okay.
Yep.
So That means in my little continuum over here with the orange line on this side, you're more aerobic when you're in a relaxed state. You're more anaerobic when using maximal power. And then you have in between, yeah? So in between it might be intervals. It might be like 400 meters. It might be a sport like, let's say, soccer, which uses mixed energy systems. Does that make sense? And they bounce between the two. So your question was if I remember right, or before we apply it, I should say, is where are the real benefits of breathing?
Yeah.
So after I did these VO2 max tests, I thought, well, I can't start paying for everybody to do a VO2 max test. So, but I needed more data, more information. So I ran an online breathing fitness challenge. And what I did was I used a field version of a VO2 max test to see what was happening. And I wanted to test two things. I wanted to get people interested in breath training. So I gave them a 10-day training program. At the start of the program, I made them do a 12-minute run and said, okay, run it any way you want, run as hard as you can, get as far as you can. And then I want you to time your recovery period. Okay, so that will give me an indicator whether they were good at whether this was going to improve the performance of the run or the recovery. In other words, the more towards the anaerobic and the max power, or more towards the relaxation, the aerobic metabolism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Then I trained them just in breath training for 10 days. So in the Oxygen Advantage methodology, I trained them for 10 days. I gave them this is all done for free, gave them everything for free. And then I got them to retest afterwards. And in the retest, I did the same thing. I said, nose breathe for as long as you can. You can go into mouth breathing. I want you to run as hard as you can for 12 minutes. And then I also want you to record your recovery time. What I found was that performance improvement was about 1 to 2% on average. Okay. But recovery improvement was, if I remember right, it was 32 to 40% improvement in recovery. In other words,
how did you measure that? How was the measurement done?
It was subjective, so it was timed, and timed until you were breathing calm after the run. So once they finished their run, time to calm breathing in and out of the nose. Okay, and that was done on the run before and the run afterwards. Yep. So this would lead back to what we're finding anecdotally is that breathing is amazing. Like the foundations of breathing is it's good for health. It's good for relaxation. It's good for rebalancing all the go that we have in this world. And when you do that, it really benefits repeat sprint sports, challenging mental performance sports, and it will also have some crossover into max strength and power, even for a 100-meter sprinter. But the real beauty of it is in all those field sports and endurance sports is where they'll get even more benefits. And then the benefits to a max strength sport is actually in that they can relax and recover from their training and be repaired and ready to go the next day.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose, Daniel, it's probably worth breaking down breathing, because some people may be listening and just wondering what sort of breathing is going on here. So you're talking about nose breathing during rest, during physical exercise, and during sleep. You're also talking about slow breathing, resonance frequency breathing, maybe, or cadence breathing, breathing with good use of the diaphragm, but then doing breath holds, which is the other extreme, because I'd be thinking about, say, the maximum strength or maximum power. If we're practicing breath holds during jogging, and we're lowering our blood oxygen saturation down into the mid-80s, and we're increasing carbon dioxide, that's going to cause adaptations, which it's thought to improve the buffering capacity inside the muscle compartment, which in turn would also impact people who are involved with anaerobic. So both from the aerobic perspective to the anaerobic perspective, breathing, because sometimes in my mind, people think that breathing is just taking that deep breath, but there's more to that.
I fully agree with you. I didn't know whether that was a question to me or to Daniel, because
that's you.
You're absolutely right. Like for me, breathing, and breath training, 90% of the benefits are about health. Okay, so it's about helping you to breathe better through the day. It's about helping to restore better parasympathetic tone in the nervous system. It's about improving your sleep. It's about improving your focus and concentration. When you train the fundamentals of breathing, which is the oxygen advantage and everything we do in the oxygen advantage, that benefits your whole life. And then you can layer on the extra bit of performance work that will give the elite athlete or give you the extra edge in sport. And there are small aspects that will really benefit you, but it's really about restoring your breathing to your innate capacity, to your natural abilities. That's where the real power of it is my feeling on it and my experience of it.
So would you think a huge benefit for elite athletes that practice, let's say 4 hours a day, 2 hours and then 2 hours, very, very hard, and that they have an elevated pulse rate probably for, I don't know, 30 to 60 minutes, maybe 2 hours, and then they go back at it again, and then an elevated pulse rate for 1 to 2 hours again, that affects their, resting pulse and then their sleep, and then you go back at it. So the main benefit would be to calm down, like you had the recovery right after. So when you go back into your next training session, you don't perform at 80 but at 100, and continue along that way. Would you say that's the biggest benefit?
The old adage in sport is the fittest man isn't the one that can run the fastest, but the one that can recover the quickest. Right? That's an old saying in sport. Which I think is absolutely spot on, and that's where breathing comes in and really benefits that. Like, if you're not, I think that a lot of elite athletes think they are recovering well, but the reality is that they're not. Now you can put metrics on this and relate it across to heart rate variability, and I know you've had other people on and talking about that. And I used heart rate variability for 3 years back 2015, 16, 17. And I just found that actually, when you become trained in it, your breathing is much more sensitive to recovery and to knowing the state of your being than any tech is to date. And I tried quite a lot of them back then. And I just found that my breathing was much more sensitive. So when you train your breathing and get used to the Bolt score and even your maximal breath holds, that when you get a sense of where you are and how efficient your breathing is, it then acts as a amazing mirror for how well you're coping with the stressors of life.
I know we had this discussion, Leo, I think 6 months ago, that I think these biometric devices has a role to play, especially the first couple of years, because you want to get into some sort of more routine, you want to get the immediate feedback, see what happens. But as you get dialed in, you can kind of leave it more and more and be more, you can feel it versus to see it. So, but there is a role for them to play as well. And it's good to see your HRV, your pulse rate, respiratory rate, whatever they may, how your sleep is, because I think that's a motivational factor for a lot of athletes.
If you're that way inclined, if you're a quantitative person that loves numbers and you understand how to use the tech, I still use it with a lot of clients who are starting their journey and that way oriented, that quantitative analysis oriented. I think it's a brilliant lead in for people, but essentially, like, the most complex piece of tech that is known is what's in there. We haven't figured it out yet at all. And I think it's just amazing. And all you have to do is learn how to tune in. It's there for you.
Leo, so in terms of recovery, there's going to be a number of factors that are playing a role there. What do you think those factors are? So if somebody is thinking about breathing, how can breathing help aid recovery? Is it the fact that you have your mouth closed during physical exercise, that there's increased oxygen delivery? Is it because of balance of the autonomic nervous system? Is it because...
You would think at the end of that marathon that it would take me a long time to recover afterwards, right? I was fully recovered within 3 days. I hadn't been training in judo because I was specializing in the marathon and just focused on that. I didn't want to get injured. So I went back to training, absolutely annihilated myself on the Thursday. So the marathon was on a Sunday. That was a Thursday night. And I knew that I was fully recovered. And I said, you know what? I'm going to compete this weekend. And I competed the following weekend in the over 30s of veterans national championships. And I ended up getting a bronze medal in it. So I competed at quite a high standard for vets, and fully recovered within a week in a completely different sport. The benefits to breathing for recovery is quite simply, one, you're going to have a more resilient nervous system by training your breathing as a whole. In other words, you'll have a higher parasympathetic tone, and you'll be able to recover your sympathetic tone quicker. By doing that, then you're going to have benefits on, you'll also then be able to use your breathing to calm your heart rate quicker and your blood pressure quicker after exercise. Because as we know, the heart is not separate to the diaphragm. The heart sits inside the diaphragm. It literally, if you look at a cadaver study, it makes an impression in the diaphragm. There's no separation. So as you restore your breathing more quickly and more efficiently directly after your sport, you're automatically calming down the heart rate. You're automatically calming down blood pressure. You're sending signals to the brain and the autonomic nervous system to rebalance and restore straight away. And you're starting the whole repair process in your body almost from your first breath after you finish. Whereas somebody who is less aware of their breathing or is less trained and has a less efficient breathing, then they're going to be afterwards, they're going to be out of breath for longer. They're not going to be thinking about it. So they're going to maintain that adapted breathing pattern for a lot longer, which is going to keep the whole body and mind in a state of stress for a lot longer. Then they mightn't sleep as well, which means they're not going to recover and restore. They're not going to get rid of all of that, all of those metabolites that you generated during the day. And now it goes into the next day and the next day and the next day. And any recovery modality really is about calming the body down. Some of them do it indirectly, some of them do it indirectly, but it's about calming the body down so that you can sleep better. And sleep is where recovery really happens.
A question then, how do you, now I know this is a difficult question to answer, but the two aspects, raising your baseline and also the ability to, if you tell somebody to slow breathe, you get immediate effect after a few minutes, but you don't raise the baseline that quickly. What would you say a person can expect? How many months or how much training do they have to put in to raise their actual baseline? Because you can get immediate effect. So what's your, as a coach, what do you tell your students when they come?
So my background is in S&C, which means that I analyze training programs to quite a fine detail so that I know at least what response I want to get out of it. And this is something that proved difficult, even with the array. Like the Oxygen Advantage has quite a narrow set of techniques, and there's multiple techniques in there that actually elicit similar types of responses. When I'm coaching people, at this stage, I use two techniques, right? I use a preparation for high altitude training, which is a walking breath holds interspersed with a 60-second rest period. Okay. I use that for improving CO2 tolerance and dampening CO2 sensitivity. And then I use breathe light to breathe right. And they are my bazookas. They are for me, they are the two best breathing techniques out there for training your breath. And if I was to pick any techniques in the whole world, I'd say, give me those two any day of the week. And eventually you'll restore your breathing. Okay. Now, as I've dove into breathing and all different techniques and all different methodologies, I do have a couple that I use that speed up the results of for my clients. So typically I would say to people that for the general population who aren't used to training, I would say anywhere between 12 weeks and 6 months to fully restore their breathing. And for an athlete who is motivated, who understands training and that they actually have to do it consistently, and that could be a motivated person, it just tends to be more athletes, I would say anywhere between 6 and 12 weeks is all it takes. That's it, a focused work. Now, I'm pretty strict in what I mean by that. So I'll say, like, I'm old school, as you taught me originally, Patrick, is that's a minimum of 2 training sessions a day, an ideal of 3 per day. And that's gradually putting in the lifestyle aspects around it. And it may need some support from lifestyle, like adaptations to sleep, maybe a little bit of supplementation and some changes to food and that. I do include that because I just have that expertise. But the main heart of it is those 2 techniques, those 2 oxygen advantage techniques, done consistently every day for that length of time.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm just thinking about athletes getting burnout or exhaustion. Do you see this happening? Is this something that happens out there? And could breathing play that role? And if an athlete is more in tune with their body and stress levels, they may be able to offset that, or you understand what I'm trying to say, prevent it from happening.
Absolutely. And I suppose the measurements was something else Daniel asked. I just use a Bolt score. I use the maximal breathlessness test. They're my 2 main go-to. I know Brian McKenzie, he has what I call the maximal exhale score. And I believe he has a bit of research coming out on that. I use that for people who are a little bit less, let's say, people who are more quantitative based and want a breathing score for it. It's a nice one for them. But my main one is Bolt, and everyone we teach in the oxygen advantage. That's the first thing. Our athletes burnt out all the time. Like, I've worked with athletes who are on medication to help them to get to sleep, and they think that they're ready to go. And these are Olympic level athletes, and they think that there's nothing wrong. You got to remember that just before burnout, when you're stressed, you lose a sense of interoception, or you can't feel the signals that's going on in your body. Your brain doesn't see them clearly. So you don't know what you don't know. So you just keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. So when you do the Bolt, and you've all had athletes who, at the top of their sport, and all of a sudden they're producing an 11-second Bolt, and you're like, oh, something's not right here. And are they on a road to burnout? Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sure, Patrick, you have some, maybe you want to give some cases or just some athletes that come to mind, that, and Daniel, you too, just so people get an understanding. This isn't just Leo and his clients' version. Oxygen advantage instructors across the board are seeing this.
Oh, we've seen it, and not necessarily either professional athletes, Leo. I've seen actually just normal recreational athletes pushing it too hard. They might be involved with triathlete or whatever. And myself and Daniel were talking to one, I can't remember who it was, but he told us he was pretty much at the peak of his game at a world-class level, had exhaustion, and he was bedbound for 6 months.
Yeah.
Like, that is some change.
Well, Paul Chek is a very famous trainer over in the States, and he put it wonderfully. It's every summer needs a winter. Every day needs a night, every summer needs a winter. And you can go without winter for a year, 2 years, for even 2 or 3 decades. But eventually, winter comes. And what winter means is winter is the time for nature to hibernate, for you to calm down, for you to relax, for you to recover, for you to go inward and look and see what's going on inside yourself. Yeah. In other words, it's your time to relax and restore and regenerate. But if an athlete pushes it, and they can push it for decades at an elite level, but if they do that, eventually winter will come. And it will result in them being, I've seen it with very bad diseases and mental health issues and chronic fatigue syndromes in people who are, they get to their 40s, sometimes 50s, and all of a sudden their body just falls apart.
And chronic fatigue syndrome we have worked with that too over the years in terms of gently rehabilitation and bringing balance to the autonomic nervous system, almost that you're reversing the overtraining that's happening. And you're doing it so gentle over a period of time to help bring regulation. And CFS is just one of those, it's not a nice condition.
No, absolutely not. And it's somebody who has been under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress and possibly trauma too for a long, long time. And it is a syndrome. A syndrome by definition means they don't know what's going on with it. They don't know where it's originating, but they do know it's chronic fatigue. So they know it's due to you burning the candle at both ends for too long. So I always take things back. I'm a simple guy. The way the human body and mind works, as I see it, is you have inputs, throughputs, and outputs. And all the time, medicine and science is looking at, well, what's going on inside? What's going on in your blood? What's going on in your HRV? What's going on in your mind? These are the throughputs, right? But what I do is I step back and I go, okay, well, what are your inputs? So what's your breathing like? What's your exercise like? What's your sleep like? What are the things that you actually have direct control over in your life that are fundamental to human beings? And then how can we improve them so that you feel better, which is your output, so that you can perform better, which is your output. So if your outputs are off, a lot of people look at the throughputs. I don't. I go a stage earlier and I go, well, what are you putting in? Yeah, I just look at that simply. And the more simple I get, the better results I seem to be getting over the years. And breathing is really at the core of all of that. And there are some other things which I know Daniel will love to talk about, which we might leave to another day, but the likes of heat and cold are very, very simple things that I think we've forgotten as humans, and we're only reminding ourselves of again.
Yeah. That also has
back to the basics,
impact on recovery and your breathing pattern. So that for another time. But yes, I think this has been fantastic. I think we could go maybe deeper in at some stage on some of these as well. I think this is interesting also because I think a lot of coaches will still understand most of this. So I think it's highly relevant. And putting the focus on recovery, like you said earlier, Leo, very interesting.
So Leo, where do you see the future of this with S&C? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I think as a whole, the Oxygen Advantage methodology will be adopted wholly across the board. They might not call it that, but essentially, nasal breathing will become a standard as a baseline breathing pattern. People will remember experts will remember that that's what we're meant to be doing, and they will communicate that downstream to everybody. Breathing through your nose at rest, during all light exercise and moderate exercise. And I think at high intensity exercise that the mouth will open depending on how people have developed and formed and what their anatomy is like over time. But do I see this coming in? Yeah, I mean, it already is. It's a wave that's coming in. My intention and my desire is that, it becomes common practice. And I turn up to a field or to a team and they're already doing it, and I just smile to myself and remember the days when it wasn't that common.
It's amazing. I was at a hurling match just a few weeks ago, and I heard one of the coaches shouting out, "Breathe through your nose," and I said, "Oh, wow, that's absolutely class." And this is a club level, so it's absolutely class, And if people want to, your website is...
It's innatestrength.com. So that's innate-strength.com. And it's also on Instagram. And Instagram will be the main social handle that I'd use too.
Innate-strength.
I do online coaching. I do a lot of one-to-one coaching is what it's based on. And obviously I'm a master instructor in the Oxygen Advantage. So at the moment, I'm doing a lot of one-to-one education in the Oxygen Advantage is what I'm getting into now.
Great stuff. Excellent.
Great.
So super. That was a great conversation. Daniel, do you want final closing words?
No, I'm all done. It's fantastic and very good explanations. I think it's you can follow this very easily. So great.
Excellent. Right, guys, we'll sign off. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you.